It's a pretty clear passage. So I want you to think about this. Think about this for your life, or maybe for the life of someone that you know, at least well enough to know some of the challenges of. That when the future looks uncertain, or when the future looks painful, faithful living can seem challenging. So, for example, when the future looks bad, when the forecast is bad, there are often spiritual off-ramps that people take. This we know to be true. We've seen it, that, for instance, the diagnosis that doesn't seem to have a remedy can provoke a spiritual crisis. The relationship, whether it's in a home, with a marriage, with a child, or a friendship, if it doesn't look like it is going to heal and to mature, it can provide an off-ramp for people. People will say, what's the point? Or in my line of work, it is certainly true that when a ministry doesn't look like it will be fruitful, pastors can take off-ramps, whether outwardly or inwardly. You can just check out of faithful living. And that is because an uncertain future, or a future that looks like it will be painful, raises some of the big questions of life, such as, is God good? Does He love me? Does He have a plan? And that is what is swirling in the background of this vision. These are the questions that are behind Daniel's dream of this great ram and this greater goat charging about. Daniel gives us a note about when in his life and when in history this happens in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. So a new vision that happens in the year 550 BC. Now, we can just guesstimate that if Daniel was 15 years old when he was taken into captivity at 605 BC, he's 70 years old when this vision happens. It doesn't matter so much the year dates to me, other than we know that this is 70-year-old Daniel. And we know some of what he had lived through to this point. He had been deported as a teen 55 years earlier. This deportation from Israel to Babylon wasn't simply a moment where Daniel was caught up in kind of world historical events, but it was a moment where he was caught up in a spiritually disciplinary event for God's people. That's what exile was. And we know that as a teen, he apprenticed in King Nebuchadnezzar's court. We know that as a teen, he had taken a stand for his faith and that he had experienced God's faithfulness. As a teen, he had interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's vision of successive empires. As a teen, he had told King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. So as a teen, he has this vision of a coming kingdom. He lives through his friends Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego standing firm in their faith when Nebuchadnezzar orders them to worship him. God delivers them from the fiery furnace. Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, and he witnesses Nebuchadnezzar's kind of sink into insanity and his repentance and his emergence back into his right mind. All of these things are behind Daniel in the year 550 BC. Some things that we've already studied are still ahead of him when he has this vision. In 550 BC, that banquet that King Belshazzar throws, where the writing appears on the wall and the kingdom is overthrown, that's still about 12 years in the future. Daniel's own lion's den challenge is still 12 years ahead of him. So those things haven't happened yet in his life. We do know from chapter 5 that Daniel at this moment doesn't seem to be prominent in the court in Babylon, because it will be that he needs to be remembered by the queen mother or by the queen when Belshazzar has this writing on the wall event. They say, hey, you should ask Daniel. You know, Daniel's not in the frame, if you will, in the seat of power so far as we can discern. So all of this is to say you have 70-year-old Daniel not in the center of the political arena, holding on to a hope that he had held onto for years. Maybe 50 years, maybe 55 years, about God's coming kingdom. And he has another dream. And in this dream, he sees a future that looks darker and more grim for God's people. He has the dream, which we just read. Verse 15, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having an appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called Gabriel, who you'll remember from Christmas time. Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Heaven wants Daniel to know what the dream means. So he came near to where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And what Daniel learns, and what we learn along the way, is that when the future looks dark, heaven views history with a different lens and with different priorities. And when heaven's priorities fuel our priorities, we can continue to live with hope. So, let me explain a little bit. First, God's rule relativizes historical events. There's a lot of potential history in this section. I'm going to give you the high points, I think. In verse 18, when he, the angel, had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. In other words, here comes the interpretation, and the interpretation is going to describe the rise and then the fall, and then the rise and the fall of empires. And this is where that horn imagery is helpful. The angel says to Daniel, as for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. Daniel had seen this ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Daniel receives this vision in 550 BC. 550 BC is also the year that a man named Cyrus united the Persian and the Mede empires, creating a great superpower. I think the greatest superpower that had been yet known as history. That's why he earns the nickname Cyrus the Great. And a lot could be said about Cyrus. Interestingly, though, in the Bible passage, God, through Gabriel, says very little about Cyrus. This thing is going to happen. Gabriel moves on. Verse 21. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. This is Alexander the Great. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Alexander the Great died very young, in the prime of his life, in the prime of his success, the age of 32, either of malaria or of poison. A lot could be said about Alexander the Great. Gabriel doesn't say anything. The two kings that history remembers as great are not where heaven is focused. Alexander the Great did not name a successor. And so his empire was broken into 4 smaller kingdoms. Verse 22. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdoms, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. Now, bold face is not complimentary language here. In the book of Proverbs, this word describes a seductress in chapter 7. And in chapter 21, describes a wicked man who puts on a bold face. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. Heaven is speaking of the supernatural power that is empowering this king. And we know this king's name. And I wish he had an easy-to-remember name. But his name is Antiochus IV. I wish he'd been named Dave, because it would be easier to say Dave a lot in the next minutes than to say Antiochus IV a lot. But I don't want to give him a nickname because it's probably your name, and then you'll be mad, and I'll be saying these things about you, and it won't be great. Cyrus the Great, not many words from heaven. Alexander the Great, not many words from heaven. Alexander the Great's successors, who weren't very great in world history, get more attention. And Antiochus, who was not nearly as significant historically as Cyrus and Alexander, gets a whole paragraph. God's rule relativizes historical events because God is building a kingdom. And God's eye is particularly on his people. That's really important to this passage. God is building a kingdom, and God's eye is particularly on where? On his people. And Antiochus IV is a particularly cruel king in the story of God's people. Carrying on from verse 24, he shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and with his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. We'll explain more in a few moments, but God is building a kingdom. The empires that seem great to the watching world are relativized to the agenda of heaven because God's eyes are on his people. Keep that in mind. Secondly, God's rule means that faithfulness always matters. In Daniel's dream, in the part that we read, he saw Antiochus IV as a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land, which is Israel, the land of God's glory. Where Daniel is from, but not where Daniel is at in the moment. Daniel's envisioning a future moment for God's people after the exile. And it's not a great moment. Daniel had already lived through bad. His vision is of a future worse. In intense period of persecution for God's people. Verse 10, it grew great, even to the host of heaven. Some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. Antiochus, we know from history, killed the high priest. When he took over Jerusalem, he killed thousands of Jews. And Gabriel, speaking for heaven, acknowledges Antiochus' reign of terror. He shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many. Verses 12 and 23 bear closer attention. Look at verse 12. This is in the vision that Daniel has. A host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground and will act and prosper. And then when Gabriel explains in verse 23, at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit. This I think, might get to the core of the passage. Antiochus is a bad man, and he does bad things. But in the midst of the vision and in the midst of the explanation, what is also foregrounded is the future disobedience of God's people. This is significant. Have you ever been in a problem? Have you ever been in a self-inflicted problem? And in your interior conversation, you say things to yourself like, if I ever get out of this, I will never do that again. Have you ever done that? Has the person sitting next to you ever done that? Well, you don't know because they're saying it on the inside. But let's assume that we have all had the experience of getting into kind of some self-inflicted problem, and we think that if I get out of this, or, if you're spiritual, you think, well, if God gets me out of this, I will always study for physics in the future. Transgression, years and decades and generations of God's people doing their own thing, was how Daniel and their friends ended up in Babylon in the first place. Surely, teenage Daniel, the intern, surely teenage Daniel interpreting dreams, surely middle-aged Daniel warning the king, surely his friends homesick to get back to worshiping God in the temple, surely they would have thought, if we ever get out of here, we're not going to do that again. If we ever get back to Jerusalem, we're going to be the perfect believers. I'll be more faithful. I'll be better. I'll be kinder. I think in the heart of all of the badness that Daniel sees that's upsetting to him, a big part of it is that he sees that God's people didn't learn their lesson. And because we know what Antiochus prohibited, we can draw conclusions about what God expected. One commentator describes it succinctly. Antiochus put an end to the daily sacrifices at the temple. He put an end to the circumcision of infants. He made it a crime to possess a copy of the Jewish scriptures. If you're an Old Testament person, what are the sacrifices? I mean, that's really the vehicle for how you hear about the gospel. That's how you hear about your sin and God's provision of salvation. That's how you hear about the possibility of forgiveness. If you're an Old Testament person, what is circumcision? It's the sign of being included and initiated into God's people. It is within the sign, a sign that God saves people who can't save themselves. He saves the helpless. And of course, God through Moses said that that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So Antiochus's deal is gospel suppression, kind of gospel identity suppression, and word suppression. That's what he's about. Which shows us what God expects his people to be faithful to during times of opposition. During times of opposition, God expects his people to be faithful to gospel proclamation, to be true to our gospel identity, and to be reliant upon the word. We know that this didn't happen in Jerusalem because the faithful priest was executed and was replaced by a compromising priest. Daniel's vision of future disobedience is highly instructive for us. It teaches us that the real spiritual challenge that we face isn't the result of our circumstances. The real spiritual challenge that we face are within ourselves. The real spiritual challenge that we face is the sin which is within us, regardless of who the king is. So what do we need as we understand that to be our condition? Well, we need gospel proclamation. We need included in a community that God is saving. We need God's word to call us back to faithfulness over and over and over. And he does call us to that. Even when the future seems hard, he calls us to know that he is still building his kingdom. And because he is still building his kingdom, and because he is ruling over history where this kingdom is being built, heaven's priorities don't change. Daniel hears two angels talking. One said to the other one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." Because I am an expert mathematician, I can tell you that 2,300 days are a little bit more than 6 years. In history, 6 years passed from the death of the high priest, the faithful high priest, to the restoration of the temple under Judas Maccabeus. Hanukkah, if you come from a Jewish background or if you have Jewish friends, Hanukkah. From a slightly different perspective, 2,300 days and nights is a very precise number compared to the more general descriptions of historical eras in Daniel that use the word times. Times is general, but this 2,300 is specific. And I think this is the point, that God's rule limits persecution's duration. Suffering can seem to slow down time. It can seem like the persecutors have all the power. But Antiochus, when we read history backwards now, is just one of many small t tyrants, just one of many small a antichrists who seem in a moment to have all of the power as they persecute God's people, but they have all faded from history. And God's people are still here. So this lesson for us becomes highly practical. No hard future lasts forever. So when you are in a hard moment, or when the future looks hard and you're thinking about taking an off-ramp, and you're thinking about checking the faith, then you need to remember that those hard moments don't last forever. God's rule means that they're limited in duration and they're limited in effectiveness. He shall rise up, Antiochus, against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. In other words, heaven, however heaven will work, is strong enough to take care of Antiochus. It's okay, Daniel. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. Which probably means not so much that he didn't understand what the angel was saying, as much as it's difficult to take in. But when heaven's lens on history becomes our lens, heaven's priorities remain our own. And it's interesting, Jesus does this, as far as I could find, twice in the Gospels, where he resets our priorities in the face of opposition, because God is building a kingdom. And empires and epochs and eras come and go. But God's control is sure. And where is his attention? I already told you. His attention is on his people. And this is what Jesus shows us at two different places in the gospel. Let me show them to you. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is sending his first disciples out on mission, and he tells them to expect opposition. When they persecute you, Jesus says, in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher, and the servant like his master. If they have called the master, him, of the house of Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear of them. For nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the dark, say in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. And this is the key verse. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore. You are of more value than many sparrows. Jesus says, keep after heaven's priority of gospel proclamation. Tell the world about me no matter what, all the way up to my return. And it's interesting, in Luke 12, Jesus uses similar words, but in a different setting. In Luke 12, Jesus warns not against kind of taking the off-ramp out of doing mission, but he warns against a different kind of off-ramp, which is the off-ramp of being a hypocrite. The off-ramp of looking good on the outside but not being converted on the inside. Because in Luke 12, Jesus warns against the leaven of the Pharisees, verse 1, which is hypocrisy. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, what you have said in the dark shall be heard in night, and what you have whispered in private rooms, you catch the difference, shall be proclaimed in the housetops. I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do. But I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he is killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Not one of them is forgotten before God? Why, even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, for you are of more value than many sparrows. And I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of God will also acknowledge before the angels of God. So Jesus first in Matthew says, prioritize staying on mission, come what may. But secondly, he says, prioritize faith in me. Prioritize trusting that I am the one through whom forgiveness is found, that I am the one who will be with you all the way up to and at final judgment. It sounds a lot like stay true to gospel proclamation. Keep living out your Christian identity. Be confident in the Word, because God is building a kingdom. And in both places, perhaps you noticed, Jesus describes himself as the Son of Man, whom we met last week in Daniel chapter 7. This very one to whom was given a dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. When the future looks hard, whether it's Daniel being a given of the future, a vision of the future, and when he sees not only future persecution, which he was accustomed to being in Babylon, but future disobedience, and the not learning of the lesson. Or when Jesus sends his disciples out to talk about him. Or when Jesus tells his audience to believe in him from the inside out, to be changed from the inside out. In all of these ways, God is building his kingdom. The future can look hard, but God is in control. He's building his kingdom. His priorities remain the same. So here are 4 invitations for you. If you look at 2025 and to you, your future looks hard. And if in your mind you feel like you're close to an off-ramp, won't you step back? God's building a kingdom. The kingdom that we read about, the ram kingdom and the goat kingdom, those kingdoms are on the dusty pages of history. God's building a kingdom that will live forever. If you are frequently anxious about world events, second invitation, the affairs of cities, states, and nations where you have zero influence, God calls you to adopt his focus. Where is his attention? His attention is on his people. He's building a kingdom of grace for the undeserving, inclusion by faith of the helpless. He's a word that endures. If you feel, third invitation, that in the great passing of history and in the rising and falling of kingdoms and republics, if you feel that you are of little value, hear what Jesus says. Not only is heaven's eye on his people, heaven's eye is on you. You are worth more than what? You're worth more than many sparrows. And if you're not on board yet, I would invite you to come and to meet the only king that history will ultimately regard as great. Not Cyrus the Great, not Alexander the Great, not Antiochus who thought he was great, but the great king who is happy to be your Savior because he loves you. Would you not come and follow after him?